A call to order the regular city council meeting for Monday, November 20th, 5:30 PM. I would ask at this time if you'd please silence your cell phones or put them on vibrate to limit interruptions. Moving on to item number 1 on the agenda, it's roll call.
Burlingame.
Here.
Evans.
Here.
Cancer.
Here.
Olson. Pittner. Pajagula. Ross.
Here. Please join me in number 2, the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and
to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Moving on to item number 3 on the agenda, that is the mayor's report. Just have a few meetings to talk about or to mention. We had a chamber board meeting, one-on-one Task Force 21 meeting. Also took part in a North Dakota National Guard reception out in Washington, D.C. Since our last meeting, we had our first meeting of the NAS Authority, and we elected a chairman and a vice chair. Attended a town hall meeting on the Minot Air Force Base. Also took part in a planning meeting for an upcoming suicide symposium scheduled for September of '24. Took part in a firefighter graduation. Since our last meeting, we do have something that hasn't happened in 40 years, and that's Mount High winning the state Class A boys football championship, so congratulations to them. And yeah, are there any questions, comments? We will move on to number 4 on the agenda. That's the city manager's report. Harold.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. As is typical, the city manager memo is prepared for you and in the council packet available to you and the public. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the council may have at this time.
Any questions for Harold? Any questions for Harold? If not, thank you, Harold. We will move on to item number 5 on the agenda, and that is consider the report to the Planning Commission. Item 5.1, a public hearing on the text amendment. This is the annual kind of review of zoning for the city, and these are just kind of updated text amendments. So if there is any public comment, we are open now. Second call for any comments on item 5.1. If there is nothing, what are the wishes of the council?
Mr. Mayor, I move we close the public hearing and approve the item as recommended.
I'll second.
We have a motion by Mark, second by Steve.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
I'd like to offer one amendment to the amendment, and that would be following discussion at the Child Care Committee. One of the recommendations in here would be Section 2, letter B. At the way that it's worded now, only allows for one additional employee in a home daycare. And the Child Care Committee members voted and agreed that 2 additional employees would be needed at some time, possibly related to the children that would be in the care of that home daycare. So I would offer that as a motion.
As an amendment.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, as an amendment.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Have a motion or an amendment. Lisa, a second by Scott. Is there any discussion on the amendment? John.
Thank you, Mayor Ross, council members. So Alderwoman Olson is super close. So it went from 1, that's the existing, right? And then what I proposed was that we go to 2 employees. At the Child Care Committee, it's actually was proposed that it go up to 3 employees. When I presented to Planning Commission, I prompted them, telling them I'd remind them at the end to see what their thoughts were on which direction they'd like to go, and I did not remind them. And so what we got is what I originally presented to Planning Commission. So really, council needs to determine if it's 2 employees or 3 employees. Child Care Committee recommends 3. Planning Commission recommends 2, but really it's 2 because I didn't prompt them again to remind them to really evaluate that one change. So just to correct it. So
Yes,
that-
and I'm appreciative of that. So 3 was the number that the Child Care Committee had discussed. So thank you.
So is your amendment 3?
Yes, it is.
That's okay with the
Friendly,
second?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any further discussion? Thank you, John. No further discussion. We have an amendment. Please call the roll.
Olson,
Yes.
Bittner,
Yes.
Paugugula.
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Cancer.
Yes.
Moving on to the original motion as amended. Is there any further discussion? There's no further discussion. Please call the roll.
Cancer,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Bittner, Paugugula.
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame.
Yes.
Evans.
Yes.
And that motion carries. Moving on to item 5.2 on the agenda, major subdivision preliminary plat, Sacred Heart Edition. What are the wishes of the council?
Move approval.
We have a motion by Lisa. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Steve. Is there any discussion? Any discussion on the item before us? If not, please call the roll.
Olson,
Yes.
Bittner,
Yes.
Paugugula.
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Cancer.
Yes.
Moving on to item number 6 on the agenda, that is our consent. We have 13 items on our consent agenda. Now is an opportunity if anybody wishes to have any of them pulled. If there's no motion to pull, if there's no request to pull, what are the wishes of the council?
Move approval.
We have a motion by Paul. Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? If there's no further discussion, please call the roll.
Bittner, Paugugula. Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Yes.
Olson.
Moving on to action items. Item 7.1, the 2024 Signal Improvement Award of Bid. What are the wishes of the council?
Move approval.
We have a motion by Paul. Is there a second?
I'll second.
A motion by Paul, second by Steve. Is there any further discussion?
Yes.
Steve?
Thank you. I just wanted to point out for the benefit of the public that we're talking about upgrading traffic signals at one single intersection of the city on South Broadway and what is it, 17th or 18th Avenue. And the cost for this is $764,000. Now, that includes some concrete work for ADA ramps we normally might not have to do. But I think this is a good example of the kind of financial constraints the city is facing, particularly with inflation and supply chain issues. Again, when I first saw $700,000 for a traffic light, I really got sticker shock. But that's the reality of what we're facing. So I hope citizens would understand this. And when we talk about property taxes and sales taxes and things like that, that they would understand that there is a need for those. The costs are really much, much more than anyone would anticipate. Actually, it's not all that much more than the engineer's estimate. And I think we got a decent bid here, but it's just things get very, very expensive. I never would have thought that a traffic light would be $750,000, but that's what it is.
Thank you, Steve. Any further discussion? If not, please call the roll.
Bittner,
Yes.
Paugugula.
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Moving on to item 7.2, accept the rebid for wayfinding Phase 1 and authorize a budget amendment. Now, this is one that was tabled at the last meeting, and the motion that was tabled was from Alderman Pittner to reject the bid for wayfinding Phase 1 and approve the revised priority list for the wayfinding project. And the motion was seconded by Alderwoman Evans. So we want to keep the bid, right? I mean, if we reject the bid,
So I'll make the first motion to accept the rebid for wayfinding Phase 1.
I'll second that.
we have a
I'm just wondering if we want to deal with motion on the table first.
Yes, yep, we would handle the motion on the floor, which is
Oh,
to
right.
reject. Yep.
Just
So if you
Oh,
want to,
So is there any, Paul, go ahead.
in order to simplify, can I withdraw my motion if everyone agrees, since I'm the original motion maker?
It's moved and seconded, so does anybody object to withdraw of the motion? Or it can just be voted on to reject it.
Are there any objections to the withdrawal? If there's no rejections, then we can move forward with the withdrawal. Thank you, Paul. So now I will entertain a motion. Carrie?
Okay, so I'm going to make a motion to accept the rebid and approve the budget amendments on first reading and authorize the mayor to sign the contract.
Second.
We have a motion by Carrie, a second by Paul. Is there any further discussion?
I wanted to
Steve.
ask how to split this motion. I would support most of, but there are a couple of items I wanted to vote on separately. What would be the proper?
You would move to split the question and then state how you would like to have it split.
Okay, then I would move to split the question, and I would like to have it split in terms of the two downtown arches to be taken out of the motion and voted on separately.
Were they part of the,
I was waiting to see if there was a second of the
Oh,
motion
okay.
before I
Second
provided
for
it.
discussion.
we have a motion and a second, Harold?
Yeah. So the recommendation from staff is, so the wayfinding committee met late last week and actually reaffirmed the priority list that was already established. So what council is considering tonight is to move forward with what has already been bid for the second time, which includes only the installation of the wayfinding signage at the highway and then the primary and secondary signs throughout the community. Council has not taken any action with regards to the archways this evening. Those would remain in the original priority list as established. Also, my memo outlines that should the council move forward with this action tonight, and the budget amendment would allow us to use some money already budgeted in the 2024 budget to meet the constraints of this contract. That would leave about just under $215,000 left in what the council's already allocated between the 2023 and the 2024 budgets. And then staff would recommend moving forward next with the updating of the monument signs. We have 5 monument signs at the entrances of the community. I want to state clearly that this is not a complete demolition and reconstruction of those signs. The base and the foundation and the probably 90% of the sign would remain in place, but we would update those for contrast and consistency, because I think each one has a different logo. So depending on which entrance you come into, the logo is different for the city of Minot. So those would be updated. We estimate, and these estimates from the engineer are 2 years old now at this point, but we estimated about $18,000 per sign. So our recommendation would be is let's do the highway signage, the primary signage, and the secondary signage, which is what the council is making a motion on this evening on whether or not to approve and award the bid. Then, after the first of the year, council or staff would move forward with bidding of the upgrades of the monument signage, which would then come back to council for approval next year. And then council can pick up whether or not to fund any other priorities with regards to wayfinding signage as part of the 2025 budget process.
So at this point, make sure I understand the gateway signs aren't under consideration, aren't being funded.
No, the action
For this
tonight
motion.
would not allow that to move forward. We have no funding identified or allocated for that yet at this point.
Then I have no need to split the question because there's just one question.
Just withdraw.
Yeah.
There's no objection, then Steve will withdraw his motion, which takes us to Carrie's original motion. Is there any further discussion? Anything further? If not, please call the roll.
Evans,
Yes.
Cancer,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Bittner,
Yes.
Quadrigula,
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame.
That takes us to item number 8 on the agenda, that's personal appearances. Now is an opportunity if you wish to address the council. We'd ask you to keep your comments limited to 5 minutes to respect others who wish to address the council. Now is your opportunity.
have an issue with your cord.
Oh.
That's hanging out. The cord is getting pinned. I think it'll be fine.
Put it down.
I think this will be okay.
Good? And
Yes.
we'll figure that out.
At the October 6th City Council meeting, I was disappointed to experience using the podium to find that it's not ADA compliant. April 2023, I sent the city an email addressing the concerns on the podium not being accessible to people in a wheelchair. Alderman Paltragula, you responded back that you tried it out and it appeared to be at an appropriate height and that you trust that your architects indeed designed it that way. You stated that the design standards called for the building to be fully accessible, so your assumption was everything will work out. The engineers did not modify the north entrance to City Hall to meet ADA requirements for occupancy or ICC Code 1010-16 on thresholds. Or I think it's 1010-17 on thresholds. There was a misprint that Luke Chalema sent out. Construction did not catch it, nor did the city inspector. You also stated in talking with Harold Stewart, your suspicion was confirmed that the city does not have a single point person having to do with accessibility. You stated that Lance, the chief engineer, comes the closest, and Alderman Burlingame's organization, Independent Inc., does some consulting with the city. Alderman Burlingame, your response to my April email was that the issue was being taken very seriously. As the director of Independent Inc., I was disappointed and disheartened not to have received a response back on the emails I sent recently on the downtown facade improvement program addressing ADA push buttons or realistic proposals for ADA accessibility. The downtown facade improvement program has ADA push buttons as a component, but were not being promoted by Jonathan Rosenthal, the Economic Development Administrator. Even though the City Council has since approved adding $5,000 to the program, requiring ADA push buttons, realistic proposals for ADA accessibility that could and should be implemented immediately for safety and compliance. City Engineer Lance Meyer responded to the April email stating the podium will raise and lower to be accessible for individuals in wheelchairs. The microphone will be at a height that will allow you to address the council if you choose to do so. Having a wheelchair available is not the same as being utilized with the mindset of utilizing it. It's like getting dressed up for Halloween. You can't put on a Superman costume and be Clark Kent. Luke Chalema, the building official, said he had a wheelchair in his office, and occupancy is still being given without meeting ADA requirements for occupancy, including City Hall. At the roundtable on issues impacting the disabled communities, Alderwoman Evans stated Alderman Burlingame, through his organization Independent Inc., invited members of different disabled communities to do a walkthrough before City Hall was occupied. An advocate for North Dakota Protection and Advocacy stated the podium did not have to be ADA compliant, but a table could be brought in that would allow me to have a forward approach, being able to utilize the work surface in the same way a standing presenter would, told papers or a laptop. A forward approach rather than sitting perpendicular to the podium with a quarter of the city council to my back. It would allow me to best see the council members, even though it's still difficult with the height and depth of the council seating. This response was appalling to me. In few words, I can't explain how it felt. Even though City Council approved the additional $5,000 for the downtown facade improvement program requiring ADA push buttons, I'm concerned that Harold Stewart, the city manager, wanted this recommendation to City Council to be reconsidered by the Renaissance Zone Review Board. I'm curious why that was. During a walkthrough at Ascend Wellness, Jonathan Rosenthal, the Economic Development Administrator, halted conversations on ADA push buttons and fire escapes. He said that they were not included. He was also going to call Melinda Howe's architect. At the roundtable meeting, Jonathan was caught in the lie. He also halted this conversation and said, I don't know why I was addressing it, and said even though I did that, he would still support the ADA push buttons. Here is why is not important.
If you can wrap up your comments, you are now approaching the 5-minute time limit.
Ascend Wellness is the first business downtown that has ADA push buttons, excluding City Hall. My concern that Harold Stewart, being the supervisor to both Jonathan Rosenthal, the Economic Development Administrator, and Luke Tlema, the building official, this attitude on accessibility, I'm concerned moving forward that the city of Minot is not going to move forward with accessibility the way that is stated by the ADA civil rights law. If the city of Minot's not taking it seriously, I'm concerned that the DOJ may have to step in where it is that they do make accessibility a priority.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else who wishes to address the council at this time? If not, we will move on to item number 9, and that's miscellaneous and discussion items. I think at this time, before we get to item 9.1, I am going to ask Scott Burlingame, Councilman Burlingame, he'd like to address the council.
Sure, and I want to kind of address a few of the things that Ms. Gunderson just spoke of and kind of break down both my take on some of the things throughout the emails that we have received and the public comments that have been made prior to tonight. Obviously, I prepared this prior to coming here. The issues are kind of multi-layered, and I'm undoubtedly going to miss a few things, but I want to touch on as few as I can and within keeping in a time frame that can get everybody home at some point tonight. I want to thank Billy for bringing this forward. We need engaged citizens, and we need people with disabilities who are engaged in making their community stronger. I'd also like to thank Alderwoman Evans for forming the Disabled Persons Roundtable. Before being elected a year ago, this was my best opportunity to interact with city staff and decision makers about issues regarding accessibility in Minot. While the topic about how to make Minot more accessible is complex and nuanced, the process starts by talking about the challenges to the right people at the right time, and those meetings made it possible. I would also like to provide my guidance on issues that we talk about accessibility in Minot and the City Hall in particular. As I do this, I want to kind of let everybody know my qualifications in doing so. I have worked for a federally funded disability advocacy organization for 23 years. In my service and in my role in that job, it is to ensure that people with disabilities are integrated into the community and to ensure the communities in which we live are welcoming and accessible to them. I've attended multiple trainings on the Americans with Disabilities Act and have provided or overseen accessibility surveys at hundreds of buildings across the state of North Dakota. I would also like to say that once you learn the basic accessibility standards, you can't unlearn them and you see problems everywhere you go. It might be a wrong parking sign here, a paper towel rack in the wrong spot there, or a door that opens the wrong way in another spot. The fact is, I don't know that I've ever seen a building or a business that does not have some sort of accessibility issue. For that reason, I look for improvement over perfection. As I begin this, I want to address some misleading terminology that is often used with good intentions when talking about accessibility. Terms like ADA accessibility is often used when talking about general accessibility. For example, I recently purchased a microwave that was listed as ADA accessible. It was labeled as such in order to allow for customers to know that it had modifications to improve its usability for persons with mobility impairments. However, the modifications for the microwave were not required by federal law. When I address ADA accessibility, I am specifically referring to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or the ADA, and its modifications made by the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. As I said, the emails that were sent to us in the public statement, I kind of want to take a little bit of time to break down a few of the different issues. First off, I'd like to talk about City Hall accessibility. This falls under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act for state and local governments to give persons with disabilities equal opportunity to benefit from programs and services and activities. It provides requirements for state and local governments, for example, to be part of our state and local governments must communicate with people with disabilities as effectively as you communicate with others, make reasonable modifications to policies and practices and procedures, allow service animals to be with a person even if you have a no pet policy, and to provide access to ensuring that people with disabilities are not excluded from programs because existing buildings or facilities are inaccessible to them. Title II of the ADA primarily refers to the areas of City Hall that are accessible to members of the public. For example, where you go to pay your water bill, where you meet with an elected official, or where you attend a meeting like this room. Prior to the opening of the new City Hall, I did bring a group of adults with disabilities that live in Minot to walk through the City Hall and look at accessibility concerns. This group included staff who were trained in the ADA and multiple people with different types of physical disabilities. At that time, we found no major concerns with this building. Full disclosure, I did not go in and out of the north side door of City Hall. And that was an oversight on our part. I have concerns about the threshold, and if that's the case, I would like to see that threshold fixing be a priority moving forward. Is one of the best things about this building is having the ability for public use restrooms, and it's one of the great successes. Next, let's move on to Title I of the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act for employees. Prohibits governments from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities in the job application process, hiring, firing, advantages, advancement, compensation, job training, and other terms and conditions and privileges of employment. Areas of the City Hall primarily used by employees, such as an employee break room, would fall under this category. If an employee of an organization requested a reasonable accommodation, it would be the duty of the employer, in this case the City of Minot, and the employee to decide what accommodation is reasonable, what the accommodation is, and if it's a reasonable. This should be dealt with as part of the human relations process, and normally and in most circumstances will not be discussed in public. A person who is not applying to become employed by the city or is not currently employed would not be able to make accommodation requests under this title. Third, we're going to look at public accommodations in the ADA. Title III focuses primarily on private businesses, public accommodations. All new construction and modifications must be accessible to individuals with disabilities, including Title II of the ADA regulations and standards. For existing facilities, barriers to services must be removed if it is readily achievable. It is my expectation that any organization getting public funding of any sort must meet the minimum standards as set forth under Title III of the ADA. I do have concerns with mandating accessibility beyond that, as it can create confusion over what is truly required under the law. With that, I'd really like to talk a little bit about power doors, because this is coming up quite often in our discussions. Under the U.S. Access Board's Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility standards, doors are not required to be automated. Automation of doors are highly recommended for entrance doors when entering force is significant. And this goes back to where we've heard a lot of ADA power doors, whereas that's maybe help with accessibility, it is not required. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about disability awareness that has been talked about. I'm personally not a fan throughout my experiences of disability simulation projects for adults. The reason for this is simple. If I use a wheelchair for a little bit, it may highlight a few barriers that are faced, but it will not begin to show what a wheelchair is like when it's what you use for your daily life and your daily independence. If a wheelchair is used if I use a wheelchair for a few hours, when I am done, I will stand up, roll the wheelchair into storage, and go on with the rest of my life. This brief activity does not give an example of realistic example of what it's like to use a wheelchair for your mobility. Rather than that, I suggest and I listen to people who use wheelchairs as part of their daily life. I seek out their input when improvements can be made, and I create opportunities for them to be heard by others. I also accept that no two people who use wheelchairs will have the exact same experiences, and that it is important to listen to many people when trying to understand the disability experience. In my experiences, members of this body and city staff have been willing to listen to the voices of the disabled when presented with the opportunities. That being said, I do believe we can all do a better job, both with accessibility and with creating opportunities for people with disabilities to be heard. And that is all I have tonight.
Thank you, Scott. Harold?
Yeah, just to respond briefly. First and foremost, I believe that as we designed this building, our goal and objective was not just to meet the minimum standard, but to go above and beyond even the minimum requirements. Alderwoman Evans was a key leader with regards to that conversation. And that's something that our whole committee and design team, as we went through this, did try to assess. We held our architects and engineers responsible for that and continue to talk about that. We put more parking spaces for handicap out in the parking lot than what was required. We put a whole brand new elevator in the center of the building to provide accessibility to all levels. We put in mother's rooms. While that's not an accessibility issue, that is an accommodation that we have not had previously in other buildings to meet the needs of the public and the staff. Again, we have gone above and beyond. We had also had a new employee who is disabled that we had some concerns with regards to accessibility. They requested that we look at some things, and we did provide some accessibility features to that department specifically for that employee as requested. So we're more than happy to be sensitive to and accommodate a reasonable accommodation when it comes to these issues. I will also state that last week, while coming into the building on the north side, I actually had the opportunity to witness somebody in a wheelchair be helped into the building through that north door, coming off of our sewer space in public transit. The threshold was an issue. In fact, I discussed that issue with our city engineer this morning. We have some settling issues with the sidewalk, and that is on our list of things to address as soon as we can. But that being said, the wheelchair fit through the door. The buttons worked. The main thing was just the threshold issue with the lip being a little too tall to easily get up and over, and I actually had to hold the door open a little bit because the timing on the doors would close the doors faster than they could address the lip issue. So to correct just a couple other statements here, the council has not taken any action to approve an additional $5,000 with regards to the downtown facade improvement program. That was action taken by the Renaissance Board, which is to come to council for consideration, which will be on the agenda at the December 4th council meeting. I did request to go and talk with the Renaissance Board with regards to potentially reconsidering that because I didn't feel that they had enough information and understanding with regards to ADA compliance. Since then, I was informed that they do understand it and they still stand behind the recommendation, so I withdrew my request to appear before them and instead bring this issue to the council here at the council meeting on December 4th. So, many of the things that were said at the last council meeting were the things that I said at Alderwoman Evans's meeting were not accurately portrayed or stated, but I'm not here to get into an argument with regards to those. I think the main point here is that staff has gone above and beyond in the design of this building to make it as ADA accessible as possible. And it meets all minimum requirements and actually goes above and beyond that, and staff will stand behind that. I appreciate the work that Luke Tillema does within our community in trying to improve ADA access through this process. I appreciate the work the city engineer does. Every public works or every designed project, every intersection we touch, we're looking at making ADA accessibility, whether that's through ramps or push buttons or lights or audio systems that help make it so that every citizen within our community can get around our community in a safe and meaningful way. And I appreciate the work that our staff does, and I will continue to defend them on what they do. And if there's any doubts with regards to whether or not this building is ADA accessible, please come talk with us and we'll go through each of those issues one by one. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that we have a standard here that far exceeds many other public buildings, and it's something that we should be proud of.
Thank you, Harold. If there's nothing else, we will move on to item 9.1 on the agenda. That is the Magic Fund Guidelines, Ad Hoc Committee Recommendations. And Harold, I think you get to keep the microphone.
Yes, that's me again. So this is a culmination of many months of work. I appreciate the work of the committee that worked on this, and I appreciate the work of staff and those that have been working on this over the last year. The goal of this, and one of the things that, as the committee talked about this and potential changes to the Magic Fund guidelines, I want to emphasize, first of all, that these are guidelines. This isn't meant to be an exact rules and regulations to address every possible scenario that we could come up with, because there's many and it'd be impossible to do that. The goal here is to establish guidelines and principles that can be applied, that when those nuances come forward, we can look at what the intent is and how we best closely align with that intent outlined in the guidelines here. We wanted to establish some priorities, and we wanted to provide some flexibility and make sure that these funds for economic development has been approved by the voters, is being put to work and not just simply amassing in a bank account somewhere, waiting for a golden goose to come along. So those are overall the intentions of the guidelines. That's what we've used as our focus as we've gone through, and we've done some significant changes and recommendations. So first and foremost, I wanted to provide an outline of the meetings that have occurred since the ad hoc committee was created in September of last year. The committee itself had 5 public meetings where we discussed the general principles of what needed to be changed. And then the committee turned it over to staff to look at the legality of the changes, as well as the administrative challenges or abilities to execute the policy and the guidelines if it was approved. And then in November 3rd of this year, the committee came back and heard the recommended changes from staff and the complete overhaul of the guidelines. And then they did recommend unanimously the approval of the guidelines. And that's coming forward to you this evening. Just again, a recap of where this funding comes from and what we're talking about. 15% of one of our sales tax pennies is dedicated towards economic development. This generates about $1.725 million a year towards economic development. And that's what we use to build the budget for the 2024 budget off of going forward. And that'll be outlined a little bit here more in the presentation as we go forward. So what is currently allowed under the current guidelines? It's these 2 categories. It's very much primary sector driven. And there is some funding available for small business matches, for example, PACE and FlexPACE loans. But outside of those 2 uses, there is no clear direction in the guidelines of any other economic development uses that could potentially be eligible for the Magic Fund funding. So as the committee discussed this, we wanted to open that up a little bit because economic development has evolved and is much more than just the primary sector, which was in defense when this Magic Fund was created. That was the hot button topic. That was what everyone was focused on. That has adapted and changed over the last couple of decades. And we wanted to be able to provide some parameters and some ability to do that, but how? So the first fund would be what we call program administration, partnerships, and tools. These are what we spend on a day-to-day basis doing our jobs every day to try and maintain and sustain the economic viability of our community. This includes the funding for the economic development position that the city itself has, as well as our contract with the Minot Area Chamber Economic Development Corporation. It includes funding that we give to the Souris Basin Planning Council. It covers our costs with regards to LOIS, which is an online platform for marketing buildings and land for economic development. And then it also pays for our contract with Retail Coach, which helps us on retail recruitment and connection and data analysis to match up with the business plans and the adaptations of business plans in the current market environment. So that's the first thing that would be paid for out of the $1.725 million of the economic development funds. Next is these other funds that we have maintained or created, and they are in rank order of priority. So the lower the number, the higher the priority, or the further to the left, the higher the priority, and the further to the right, the lower the priority for use of economic development funds. So primary sector is still a major priority for use of the Magic Fund. That hasn't changed. We also did some changes with regards to the state program matching funds. It will still continue to support flex loans and flex pace loans. But we've opened it up a little bit that basically that should the state come up with any economic development program that requires a local match from the community, this fund within the new Magic Fund guidelines, if approved by council, would be where that local match would come from. The Department of Commerce and the governor and the state legislature is constantly reprioritizing what they're doing in economic development and what they provide in state funds. And we wanted this fund to be flexible for Minot to be able to adapt with that and leverage those funds from the state to come to our community to make our community better. Next fund would be the City of Minot Economic Development Projects. Again, this was not outlined in the previous guidelines, but what would fall under here is anything the council deems to be of economic development value to the community that they want to make a priority. This would include like the wayfinding signage, the facade improvement program, or any other type of program that the council would deem of economic vitality. This is where the city council would budget funds and distribute funds to meet those priorities and objectives. The next category is what we're calling a small business. This is basically all non-primary sector. This is any other business in the community that has need for economic development funds to be successful, although there are some exemptions and some caveats here. So retail is still not eligible. So you wouldn't be able to use these funds to recruit in a Walmart or anything like that. But any of the small businesses, this is kind of a catch-all that if there's a business wanting to come and locate or if they have business needs, this would be the fund that the council would be able to utilize through the Magic Fund to help meet those needs. The final one is flood control. Technically, this one has always been there. I believe when the language was first approved by the voters, there was a mechanism that any funds not being used for economic development could go toward to minimize the tax burden with regards to flood control. And so that's identified here as well as being eligible as per the original language. And again, just kind of going through each of these slides, will go in more detail of each of those funds. So this is the first one, the administrative cost, and again, outlines everything that I talked about previously that would be eligible under this fund. These would be decided and allocated annually as part of the annual budget process of the city council. Here's a summary again of those other 5 funds as I just went through. Another thing that we did as part of this is we identified a lead agency for each of these funds. So if anyone is interested in accessing these funds, they know who to go contact to get questions answered or how to submit an application for consideration for these funds here as well. And again, there's some examples here. Again, note here on the small business fund, there are exemptions. So this funding cannot be used towards gaming, food and beverage, retail, hotels, etc. They would not be able to apply for these funds. But any other business that is not primary sector, is not participating in a state matching fund program, would potentially be able to ask for funds through that fund. One of the terminologies that we use with regards to this is the bucket chart. So whether we refer to them as funds or as buckets, these are geared and framework somewhat loosely off of the state's hub city funding methodology. The challenge that we had, and part of the reason why it took so long for us to work through this and come to consensus on this, mainly from an administrative side, is it's very difficult to develop a formula because these things change so much and it varies depending on what the balance is in those funds, on how much funding should be recommended to go into those funds each and every year. So ultimately what we decided on was to rely on the city's budgeting process every year. And as part of the budget process, the city manager and the MACDC executive director or president would meet on an annual basis, review the current balances of each fund, assess what we see as application and requests coming forward over the next 12 months, and then make a recommendation to the city council as far as where those economic development funds should be budgeted throughout that process. And then it would be subject to change or approval by the council as part of the budget process. Another piece that we added in here, with the primary sector fund being the primary utilization of these funds, we did establish a minimum and a maximum amount here. So the minimum being 3 million, and should the fund ever be below 3 million, that becomes the priority. And the recommendation from the city manager or the MACDC president would be is all funds be directed to that fund until it is over the 3 million amount again. Once it's over the 3 million, then it's subject to other needs and recommendations as needed. And the fund should not exceed $10 million. So we're not trying to build a war chest here. We're trying to put the funding to work. And the fund should never exceed that amount. So we already have funds in the Magic Fund. So I anticipate one question would be what happens with the funding that we have already collected. And this slide provides an initial recommendation based off of the 2024 budget that the council has already approved of where this funding would go. So we've already issued and approved many of the contracts with regards to the 2024 budget. So those are coming forward, are already approved and built into the budget. So that money is already allocated. Primary sector would begin with a balance of $5 million. So it's already over the $3 million minimum threshold, but it's below the $10 million maximum. The state program matching funds would be funded to its recommended maximum of $1 million. The reasoning for that is that leverages state funding coming in. That's a very good program and includes private matches that go with that. So the city gets a significant return on investment in making those matches through those programs. So that one is recommended to be fully funded. The fourth fund, the City of Minot Economic Development Projects, would start with a total of $595,211. That's a combination of the funding set aside for wayfinding signage as well as the facade improvement program. The next fund would be the Small Business Fund that has a recommended maximum of $300,000, and we'd recommend that one be fully funded from the beginning. So in essence, most all of these funds would be fully funded with the money they already have in the Magic Fund, and then council would, based on recommendations from myself and the MACDC executive director, would reassess those balances and allocate any future economic development funds into these funds each year as part of the annual budget process. There are some protections in here with regards to revenues. We build our revenue projections in advance, and as try as we might, those aren't always accurate. So there are some triggers in here that should we run into a difficult financial year and revenues aren't coming in as expected, the city finance director would point those concerns out. And then again, the MACDC director and the city manager would get together and make recommendations to the council on any budget changes in the current fiscal year with regards to that. In essence, making cuts so that those we're not overspending the fund. The same would also apply with revenue surpluses. So if revenues come in stronger, but really the process for that would be is those additional revenues over and above what was projected would be allocated into the next fiscal year's budget process. So for example, in 2024, we budgeted $1.725 million. if revenues come in at $2 million, that additional $275,000 would be recommended and allocated as part of the 2025 budget process. The thresholds are guidelines. Council has the authority to change those thresholds at any point that they deem necessary, increase or decrease. Going into fiscal controls, some other concerns we had is the mobility of the funds between each other. And so some protections are recommended. Given that our state program and matching has been very successful, if there is a time that we have more applications than funding available in that fund, the council by supermajority vote could transfer funds from the primary sector fund to the state matching fund to meet those needs, assuming that the fund is above the $3 million minimum. But once that transfer is made, that funding cannot be transferred to any of the other funds. So once it's transferred from primary sector to state program matching funds, it cannot be transferred to any of the other funds. With that being said, the council can transfer funds between the other funds at its discretion through its budget policies and processes. With regards to the Magic Fund Screening Committee, we made no recommended changes here. A lot of this stays the same. Appointed by the mayor, 7 members, the different demographics being represented. Requires an annual report, an audit, and an application process, and all those kinds of things all stayed the same. One topic of note has been with regards to conflict of interest. We did have some conversation on this. We did recommend some changes, although this may still need some more editing and discussion. But the main conversation here is, in talking with the attorneys, how you define a conflict of interest is difficult. Just because you're an employee of an organization does not mean that you have financial interest or benefit from a decision being made. We did try to tie closely to state law with regards to this. That's where some of the language comes here, that in particular the line that says a conflicted board member, committee member, or city council member shall not participate in any activities to evaluate or debate the merits of a proposal without the consent of a majority of the rest of the body. That line specifically comes directly out of state law. But the main intent that we had here, and what we did agree with, is if there is a conflict of interest, that individual should abstain from any discussion, evaluation, or action with regards to approval or denial of that application. So that's a balance again between local guideline and policy and state law. But that was the main intent that we were striving for with regards to conflict of interest. We wanted to be careful going forward with this, though, on how we wrote this conflict of interest, because we didn't want to punish any company or organization because they're supporting our local boards and helping us make better decisions with regards to this funding. So if we have a business that is on a board making them completely ineligible to apply for the funds, and in effect penalizes them for helping sit at the table and have these discussions and make us better. But we did agree that should those circumstances arise, that if they were sitting on that board and their business was applying for those funds, that they should abstain from the conversation and decision-making of that, but not be completely ineligible in applying for these funds. So that was the intent with regards to the conflict of interest language. And with that, I will stand for any questions. We also have Brecca Kramer here as the MACDC president that can help answer any questions.
Harold, can you talk about what's next now, the timetable?
So in essence, we've brought this back for conversation to the council. This is your opportunity to discuss the recommended changes, whether or not you agree with those changes or not, what other processes you would like to see, if any, before this is approved or taken action upon by the council. And so staff is looking for further direction from you as the elected body who ultimately is responsible for these guidelines and these funds, whether or not these guidelines are sufficient and adaptable and meet your goals, priorities, and objectives.
Thank you. Carrie, you had your hand raised. Carrie, are you with us? Okay. Are there any questions? Steve?
I had two questions. First, not so much having to do with the guidelines, but what's the current fund balance?
Oh, I want to say it's close to 9 million.
I'm sorry?
I think I'm looking to Dave on what the total balance is. It's about $9 million total.
And has that been pretty stable, if my memory serves me right, lately?
It's been pretty stable over the last couple of years. The council, through the budget process, has used this economic development funds to meet other needs as opposed to putting them into the Magic Fund directly. So, for example, the wayfinding signage, the downtown facade improvement program, those kinds of things. And so once we've met those obligations, there hasn't been any surplus to go into the Magic Fund, although it's grown a little bit because I think a couple of years the revenue has come in stronger than what we projected.
The other question I had is cross between a comment and a question. You said that flood control was kind of the last bucket, the last bin, and then it was mentioned in the original proposal for the Magic Fund. I wasn't in city government at that point, but I don't remember that. If someone, for our next meeting, could find that for us, I just don't remember it there, and I'd like to know one way or the other. If it was there, regardless, I'm not real keen on it being there. If it was, I guess I wouldn't make as much of a fuss, but if it wasn't, I would oppose that. I think flood control is obviously a critical thing, but it could soak up all our money forever. And I think the citizens, when they originally approved it, and we've voted for it on several prior occasions, it's always been pitched to them, sold to them as an economic development issue, and that seems too far removed for me to really go with what we've told them before, and on the basis of which they've approved it and keeping approving it, kept approved it, whatever. Anyway, so that was the one objection. The other, I guess, comment is I think this is good. This is an improvement. The one thing I'm concerned about, though, is I think the conflict of interest section needs to be tightened up just a touch. Specifically, I mean, I might as well get this out now. I like the fact that there has to be some written notification that there may be a potential conflict of interest, but I'd also like that to be publicly and verbally stated, just so it's out in the open at the beginning of any meeting that so-and-so has recused themselves or so-and-so has declared a conflict of interest. I'd feel more comfortable if that were also publicly announced. And the other thing with the conflict of interest is I really, and again, I might be a purist in this, but I really don't care if the majority says you can participate in discussion or vote. I think that's wrong. I think if you have a personal interest, if you have a conflict of interest in something that's before your organization, I really don't think you should be participating in any discussion or any vote, even if the majority thinks that's fine. I don't think that's fine at all. So I would respectfully at some point move that be tightened up. And it also specifically be mentioned that you can't vote. I think it says you can't participate, but evaluate or debate. I think the evaluate is at an early stage in the process when you're vetting an application. I think that makes sense, but I think debating is important, or voting is important, if it should be mentioned. Other than that, I think it's a good improvement. And the buckets are a little hard to understand sometimes, but I think that does make sense. And it shows people and us what the priorities should be. It's always been intended, I think, as I remember it, as primarily a primary sector boost. And as you've said, Harold, the notion of economic development has changed somewhat, but I think both nationally and locally to include more of an emphasis on small businesses. And I think that's a good thing, kind of being an incubator, helping people get started. And I'd make the argument too that flood control really doesn't belong there. If we have any money left over, it should be to further foster kind of spirit of free enterprise and capitalism, maybe some educational programs in the schools. I know the Chamber of Commerce has junior achievement, something like that, to get people at Minot State and in the school system thinking about being entrepreneurs, thinking about whatever their major field of interest is, of how to make that a going enterprise. To me, that would be more important than a few dollars toward flood control. I still very much would argue that this should be focused on economic development, and that the basic principle here is that a rising tide lifts all boats. I happen to believe that, and I think the suggestions, the changes generally are in accord with that. But those are the only comments I really have. Otherwise, I think it's pretty good.
Thank you, Steve. Carrie?
I'm back. Can Brecca come up for some questions, please?
She's on her way.
Okay. Thanks, Brecca. So I have a few questions. One, I'm just going to follow up on Steve's. So explain the committee's thought process on how flood control is consistent with sort of the goal of providing financing incentives to businesses that desire to expand or locate in Minot.
Yeah, Alderwoman Evans, Mayor Ross, and members of City Council, I'm happy to answer that question. So I believe Alderman Padragula asked the question regarding flood control in the original ordinance or in the original sales tax information. It wouldn't have been in the original one that was voted in back in, let's see here, 2003.
It wasn't.
It is, though, in the current ordinance. And so with the current ordinance, it is one of the allowed uses under sales tax, and that's why it's in there.
What's the date of that change?
I believe it would have been the one in
2019.
2018. Would that be the latest one? I'd have to refer to city staff to confirm if that's the date.
Thank you.
But that was added in with that. And then the one maybe thing to note, Alderman Padragula and members of City Council, is if you go to page 6 under the funding schematic, right above the last of the uses talks about the flood control projects. And again, it's just in there because it is currently in the city's sales tax ordinance. And then if you go under the funding schematic, and if you refer to Mr. Harold Stewart's, the city manager's presentation, it does state in there that all other funds are fully funded at the maximum thresholds. Any additional Magic Fund dollars will be placed into the local flood control projects. And if you look in the current schematic and the flow of dollars, flood control did not have a balance there. Our goal is obviously to put the economic development priorities first, and the reason why it's in there is because it is in the sales tax ordinance. Hopefully that answers the question on that.
Second one is, I'm trying to see which section it was, but there's one section where the committee struck other established organizations and made it just Minot Chamber EDC. Do you know what I'm talking about, Brecca?
Possibly.
I'm looking for it right now. It was about recommending to, I think, city staff. And at one point, the provisions were for other organizations as well as Minot area EDC, and that was taken out.
Alderwoman Evans, I can try to answer that question, and I'd certainly encourage City Manager Harold Stewart to jump in if I miss any points there. But as far as with that one, you'll see in the new guidelines, there's further clarification. There weren't some of the, it wasn't really clear that if you're coming to receive Magic Fund dollars, who was the lead agency on those funds? For example, Service Basin Planning Council is one of the partners that is tied in with the second bucket, if you want to call it that. And with that, they are receiving funds from the Magic Fund, but they are administering the Flex Pace program through their own rules and their guidelines. And so in that case, that still comes through the Chamber EDC as an initial Magic Fund request, but once the funds are with Service Basin Planning Council, it's with their organization. The other part that you'll see, I think it's again on one of the slides in the presentation, is it'll show who the lead is under each of the fund uses. And with the past guidelines, it wasn't clear. For example, where some of the city funds have been pushed into programs like wayfinding, one of the items that was discussed tonight, That is something that doesn't go through the Chamber EDC. It actually goes through the city's Community Economic Development position and then moves forward to city. So in the slide presentation that was a part of the City Council packet tonight, that should kind of clearly define and give you a little bit more information on who is the lead. If you have questions regarding Magic Fund, if it's primary sector, it's going to come through the Minot Area Chamber EDC first, then the Magic Fund Screening Committee, and then ultimately to City Council. If it's in one of those other buckets, if you want to call it that, we've identified who those agencies are. In the past, guidelines would have just said other agencies. It wasn't very clear on who you should be contacting. And so that was the point of clarification, and that's why that line would have been struck from the original guidelines.
Yeah, and it's at the top of page 4. I just found it.
Yeah, it's at the top of page 4, where, again, we established this as part of the budget process. The city manager and the chamber EDC president and CEO meet to talk about the fund balances and those kinds of things. And it did used to have language in it that said, the Development Corporation, Minot Area Chamber of Commerce, and other established organizations with economic development and/or business development purposes to identify the primary sector industries and small business clusters. And so that was simplified down.
And I just have one final question, and hopefully both of you can address it. So we got some feedback from constituents, and one of the issues was they felt there was a huge difference between the committee recommendation and then the red lines that were edited by MACDC and city staff. So can both of you talk to what, you don't have to go line by line, but what some of those edits were, if they were substantive or were they merely, grammatical or like formalistic kinds of things?
I would assume that what we're talking about is we had the conclusion of the work in September of 2022. And so there is a red line version of that the committee did. But then that was, again, at the committee's action was turned over to city staff and attorneys to review through that to make sure that the recommendations of the committee were legal and could be legally defensible, but also administered from the city's financial policies and procedures. And that's where a lot of the conversation was over the last year, was to discuss those. And again, the work that city staff and legal counsel did over the last year was taken back to the committee November 3rd, reviewed, and that was approved for recommendation to the council with a unanimous vote from that. So all the work that the city staff did, MACDC staff, legal counsel, was all re-reviewed by the committee and recommended for approval by action of that committee. But yes, there was
So I guess
substantive changes.
I'm referring to at the top of the red line document, we have approved by ad hoc on November 3rd, and then the edited by city staff at MEDC just last week on November 14th. And that is where there is some, I think, confusion about what the difference is between what was approved by the ad hoc committee and what edits were made since that time.
Alderwoman Evans, I believe I'm tracking what you're asking as far as with this question. So Alderwoman Evans, Mayor Ross, and members of City Council, the difference between what was presented to the ad hoc committee, and Alderman Pittner was there, so please feel free to jump in, and so was your city attorney and city manager. What was presented to the ad hoc committee on November 3rd was the guidelines as they stand with all the red lines items that the committee worked about a year ago. We took line by line and went through legal review. So I'll give a couple of examples of what would have changed from the draft on 11.3 to 11.14. For example, there were some minor title changes. They were calling the Chamber EDC as a director, and we actually put the formal position in there. So it went from executive director to president CEO. There were a couple of typos that we called out during that meeting that the group discussed. And again, they were very minor grammatical items that were changed, nothing of substance. The red line version that's in the packet was reflective of the work by the original committee, which involved members, those are all public meetings, and involved members of City Council and the Minot Area Chamber EDC.
So just to clarify, like the changes that were made between November 3rd and 14th were not of substance that would need to go back to the committee for approval. They were cleanup kind of things.
That is correct. I'm not aware of any substantive changes from the November 3rd meeting to what's before you this evening.
Great.
I would
That's all I
agree as
have.
well.
That's all I have. I thank you both for answering those questions.
Thank you, Brecca.
Yep,
Any-
thank you.
Paul,
Thank you. I don't have any questions for Brecca, so I guess if anybody else has, so she can sit down.
any other questions for Brecca?
And my questions can
Lisa.
be for Brecca or for Harold. And they kind of go together. So one is acknowledging that we did receive some emails from a few individuals who had some concerns. And one was the appeal process per se. I don't think this person necessarily called it an appeal process, but the fact that if an application was made for Magic Fund dollars, it could be denied initially with the Magic Fund, with the MEC EDC board, and never move forward. So none of us at this dais would know that the application had occurred. So that was the concern. And I guess I would add in that perhaps one of those applications could include an MEC EDC board member or a city council member, and there would be a conflict of interest. So you could have someone that needs to step aside, and you have a very small group of people making a decision. And so I'm wondering if that was discussed at all, and if there would be, any changes that would be possible to reconsider that.
I'll take that one because I think I'm the one who originally recommended the changes in the alteration to the language in the guidelines with regards to that. The concern here being, and this is up for discussion for the council, and ultimately you get to finalize whatever guidelines you would like to have. But these screening committees are set up with an intent and a purpose, right? To assess, is all the material provided? And ultimately, does this meet our priorities and goals and objectives as a community for use of economic development funds? So if that has not passed or been recommended for approval by one of those lower levels, why would it proceed forward and continue to take up additional resources and time for conversation if that's not happening? Part of the requirements here is, and part of MACDC's contract with the city and what they do is, and as well as the screening committee that the council has set up, is an annual report that delineates to you all the applications received, the applications denied. So we're not hiding it. What we're trying to do is get rid of, so if someone comes forward, just because the Magic Fund is there and because you apply for it, and even if you meet the criteria, is not a guarantee that you get funds from the Magic Fund, right? And so if the screening committees, either with the chamber or the city's screening committee, deny that and say that that does not meet our goals and objectives and priorities, then we had a stopgap in there to preclude continuing to take it up the chain if it's already been identified as a bad idea. Because ultimately, if we want the council to make the final decision on it, then we need to save everyone's time and not have the screening committees, because what are they accomplishing? What are they doing? We put them together as experts within their fields to look at these. We have some very smart people that sit on both of these screening committees. And so if they don't think it's a good idea, how much time should we continue discussing it and talking about it? Ultimately, if you want to put an appeal process in there, you can. But we've had some applications come forward recently that we didn't think were a good idea that made it all the way up to the council. And we were trying to circumvent some of that. Lisa?
And if I may respond just briefly, I think that there are two parts to that. I think there is the checking for the I's being dotted and the T's being crossed, but then there's also the determination of whether or not it's a project that the MAC EDC board wants to move forward. And I think that's the concern. I certainly have no issue with them making sure that it's ready to proceed forward. But I'll agree with this constituent in saying that it would be nice for us to realize that an application had been denied if that applicant chose to bring it forward.
And Alderwoman Olson and Mayor Ross and members of City Council, if I could also maybe further expand upon that. For example, with our internal review process, our economic development specialist, who is Mark Lyman, will do the initial review. Following that, the internal process, we also bring in our legal counsel, our outside legal counsel, to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And then with that process, very clearly on page 2 of the kind of the uses of the Magic Fund guidelines, it does say all uses of the guidelines must support one or more of the following goals. So if it is an application that meets one of those goals, we take it step by step. Is it creating new jobs? Is it saving existing jobs, expanding the local tax base? We take each of those items, we do a thorough analysis, we provide our yes, no, and sometimes there's a maybe. Sometimes there is gray areas with an application. And then, as you guys know, a part of what we do as the Minot Area Chamber EDC is we do provide our meeting minutes every month in the packet. So you would see if an application was denied. If it is denied, there's typically the rationale for it is in those meeting minutes as well. And we're certainly happy to answer any questions at any time, should there be a. I have seen in our short time where somebody has requested funds in just a basic email, and there's no financials, there's no information. And again, going back to the city manager's comment, we want to be fiscally responsible and also be advocates for any kind of development in our community, but we also want to be conscientious of everyone's time. And if an application does not meet the guidelines in any way, you won't see those moving forward, but we still will acknowledge that we've received an application.
I do want to state here as well, so looking at page 15 of the guidelines, it states this: unless provided otherwise in these guidelines, the City Council will review and consider all applications recommended for funding through the Magic Fund. Denial of an application by a supermajority or greater of any of the boards, 10 shall be a supermajority of the MACDC board or committee, 5 shall be considered a supermajority of the Magic Fund Screening Committee, which precedes City Council action, shall be final and ineligible for appeal. Appeals to the City Council can only be taken from a denial of an application by the Magic Fund Screening Committee. Applications denied by the board or committee that are eligible for and are appealed to the City Council will require the City Council to approve the application by a supermajority, 5 members. So there is still a process. What we're saying, though, is if you have a supermajority of these people sitting here saying, no, this is not a good idea, it stops. But if it's divided, and it's not a supermajority vote, that application continues to proceed through the process to the next level.
Okay, and I appreciate that information because that's helpful. There is a process in place.
We did try to
Appreciate that.
balance that out a little bit, so it wasn't a complete stopgap.
All right.
But in instances that a supermajority of these experts have said, no, this is not a good idea, then it should stop there and not waste anyone's time anymore.
Thank you.
Paul? Yep, again, no questions for Brecca, so if you want to sit down, feel free. The only thing that I would like to see added, so when we started this process about a year ago, and undertook this task, one of the things that came out from the state, actually in April of 2023, was adding tourism to primary sector. I'm trying to pull it up here. Back in April of 2023, it was added to the state website, Chamber of Commerce, kind of in the middle of this process, and I think it would be advantageous for whether it be in section 3 or 2 of the proposed guidelines to add tourism specifically, and you have to be a certified business, tourism business in the primary sector. So again, I just don't want to pigeonhole the accessibility of these dollars if we have a worthwhile endeavor that comes along. And again, I would just like to see that so that when the state has programs that come available and or there's a business that supports tourism in the local economy, we can be advantageous and take advantage of those programs. So again, that would be my one critique as to what I would like to see added.
Thank you, Paul. Mark?
Just following up on that, I was under the impression that primary sector was defined as it is in the century code. So if the state added that, it should be part of it, I would think.
I would concur, so we added some definitions, and the primary sector definition is exactly that, is what the Department of Commerce defines as primary sector. So if a tourism business came forward and had been certified by the Department of Commerce as a primary sector tourism business, they would be eligible underneath the primary sector fund. If the state creates an economic development program incentivizing tourism, they would potentially be eligible underneath the state program fund. And then ultimately, council always has at its discretion any economic development priority that you have. And if you deem that to be an economic development priority, the council could delineate magic funds towards that project underneath the City of Minot Economic Development Priority Fund.
Any other questions or comments? If not, I want to thank the committee members, and Paul, I know you were on it, and Harold, for your work, along with Steph, going through this document. So I appreciate it. Moving on to item number 10 on the agenda, that is liaison reports. Let's start with Steve.
Before I get into that, so what's the next step with these guidelines? Are we going to have them formally considered or chance to amend them or what? Or
Again, staff will await direction from council on what you would like to do. Whether
Maybe
you want
we
it on a
should-
future agenda, whether you have proposed changes or amendments to it, whether you have additional processes that you want to have other people look at this and review it and provide your recommendations. Staff is waiting for direction from the council on what you'd like to do next.
Would it be best to add it to the agenda in a month? Give us some time for some feedback, and is there any other direction? I know, Paul, you mentioned the direction. Any other direction that any members of the council would like to add to this, or to provide any direction to staff? Paul?
None at this time. I think that's a good idea to add it a month from now, and we can work with either city staff or the chamber EDC on any proposed changes that we want to see, and we can bring them forth under an agenda item, and we can vote on them one by one or individually.
I don't think this is just language there. We think we need to move forward.
So if I'm understanding correctly, we would bring it forward and put it on the agenda for the December 18th council meeting?
Correct. Does that answer, Steve?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, let's see here.
Now moving on to item number 10.
Okay. In terms of liaison activities, I'll leave it to Carrie to talk about the County Planning Commission. We are actually getting really close to promulgating a draft to disseminate publicly and have people comment on and ultimately vote on and then forward to the county commissioners. So I'll leave it to her to specify in more detail. Emergency Resource Council had an interesting meeting this past month. Every month, one of the representative organizations presents what they do, their plans and their resources for emergencies. And this time it was MDU. And they had a very nice review of safety with natural gas and carbon monoxide and things like that, and found out that they give free carbon monoxide testing. If someone thinks they have a buildup or one of their alarms goes off at home, they will come out to their customers at no charge and test for those gases. The fire department also does that. It was also interesting in terms of reliability, and we talk about resilience of our infrastructure, that the MDU representative who spoke said that in the 30-some years he had been with the company, they had never had an outage of natural gas in the community. And that's pretty remarkable. I think we have remarkably good electrical service here, reliable electrical service, and I think SRT does a good job. Occasionally their cables get cut, but I'm not sure what you can do about that. But the fact that in all the years the man had been working for MDU, they'd never had an outage. I mean, that says a lot about reliability and resiliency. I also attended an open house of the Youth Works program. They have another facility, sometimes for people who are young people who are involved in the criminal justice system. Carrie works with them, or for them actually, so she can talk more about it. But the county paid for a house, and I guess we provide some help with that, and we refer kids there through our law enforcement agency. The Commission on Aging has had a couple meetings since I last was able to report. Things are going quite well there. They have a morning cafe, which is doing gangbusters business. they're feeding up to 200 people a day. And it's a big social event, and people get a healthy breakfast and a lot of patronage there. One of the things we did was he approved pay raises for staff for the following year. And the thing that's noteworthy is that we decided as a board to give an extra 1% raise to people who made less than $50,000 a year, kind of out of the feeling that inflation and other things have hit lower income wage earners more. And kind of a graciousness of our heart, we felt that it was important to give those people extra money. And I think that'd be difficult to pull off on a citywide scale. But we did show, I think, some social conscience there. Things are going well. A lot of people are using the services. And again, we tried to be somewhat gracious to people who are maybe a little bit less fortunate than other employees. And then county planning, Carrie will talk about. Although it's not a formal liaison involvement, I'm fairly active, and my wife's even more active in the arts community in town. And there was a very interesting presentation at the Northwest Arts Center by a Native American artist who goes by Black Pinto Horse, or Monty Yellowbird Sr. He's a Minot State graduate. He's a member of the 3 affiliated tribes. He's a storyteller and painter. And he gave a very interesting and at times moving presentation on what was like growing up and going to school. And he was doing some presentations at several of the classes and things at the college. And just wanted to remind people that we have some very good resources in terms of the arts, which are part of our overall quality of life and which help attract people and businesses to the community. And one of those places is the Northwest Art Gallery, Northwest Art Center at the college, free admission, and a very nice rotation of programs. There was also an open house, an art opening just this past week. One of the artists was Charlie Beck from northwestern Minnesota. He's now deceased, but he has some very beautiful prints that actually are affordable and really reflect the scenery and the wildlife around here. So I would encourage people, if they have a chance, to go to the Minot State Gallery. It really, I think, adds to the quality of our life here to have places like that in the top. Actually, last Thursday, I had openings at both of these places. So I tried to do my bit to support them and had a good turnout. So go to Northwest Art Gallery.
Thank you, Steve. Carrie?
Well, Steve, I feel like I'm missing something from planning. It wasn't, there's not much to add. I know Steve and I keep on saying we're very close, the Planning Commission is, to the rezoning ordinance, but we really are. It's in like sort of now the formatting stage, and it will be going to the full Ward County Commission probably in the next month or two for initial approval. So that has been a monumental task for that commission. To follow up on Steve, with the Youth Works shelter, it is it's a shelter for youth experiencing homelessness and vulnerable youth under the age of 18. So it is not just law enforcement. We are one of 4 certified shelters in North Dakota, and to be a certified shelter, there's all these hoops to jump through. But that basically is for social services kids to be able to come into the shelter awaiting foster care or some placement issue. So the majority of the young people who come through the Youth Work Shelter in Minot are the social service children. So, but there is a law enforcement component as well. And then last, I know everybody has been excitedly awaiting the children's library remodel. Well, it is like done almost. Next Monday, the children's library will officially reopen. So I encourage folks to go over and take a look. It is the library board. We got a sneak peek last week, and it is fantastic. It is such a beautiful new space for the young people who use the children's library. And congratulations to the staff who have been so flexible and vigilant over there in making sure that the end product is exactly what they wanted. So yeah, you have to go see it. It's beautiful. That's all I got, Mayor.
Thank you, Carrie. Lisa?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a long list. It was kind of a busy month. The first thing is that I co-chaired the Human Relations Ad Hoc Committee along with Alderman Burlingame. The Ad Hoc Committee met on October 24th and November 14th, and our final meeting will be November 28th at 5:30 in City Council chambers. We do anticipate a few more amendments that will be added, and then we will proceed with a public input related to the ad hoc committee's updated version of the Human Relations Committee ordinance. Up until this time, we've just been working within the committee, but now we will be seeking input on the changes that we have made. Following the public input, the committee is anticipated to make a recommendation, and I believe that we will see it on our agenda at one of our December meetings. It could be the 4th, it could be the 18th. We'll certainly know by the end of November 28th. I participated in the Central Dakota MPO meeting on October 26th. And, this was a committee that was put together this summer, and we had a very long list of things to accomplish by the end of the year, and we were so nervous that we wouldn't get it done. Well, we've accomplished many of those things well ahead of schedule. So it's an interesting committee. It's a lot of work getting it set up, but appreciative to all of those that are involved. I participated in the Service Basin Planning Council annual meeting on November 2nd, which was held at the MHA Nations Interpretive Center near Newtown. And the work of Service Basin Planning Council was highlighted with the planning council members that were there. I met with a variety of individuals from Ward County Commission, First District Health, City of Minot Planning Department, Minot Fire Department, and Minot Rural Fire to discuss the 90-plus enclaves that appear within or near the City of Minot. The enclaves have been a point of discussion at the liaison committee meetings for about 2 years. The discussion led to a final determination that Ward County will take the lead on addressing and potentially remediating issues that occur in those enclaves. That information was shared with the liaison committee on November 16th, and I anticipate that we will get more information back after Ward County Commission takes action on that. I toured the Workforce Development Center with the Child Care Committee on November 13th, and I'm guessing that Alderman Burlingame will probably share more about that. And last but not least, I attended the November department head meeting, and I just want to offer a word of thanks to all of our department heads and our city staff who offer proficient services to the residents of Minot.
Thank you, Lisa. The only addition that I have from my mayor's report is I did attend last week the State Fair annual meeting and welcome the new State Fair manager, Greg Rudland. So, Scott.
All right. I appreciate Alderwoman Olson taking the issues around the Ad hoc Human Relations Commission, because that shortens my talk up a little bit here. I would like to follow up, though. The Child Care Committee did meet, and we did a tour of the Minot Area Workforce Academy up near the new Minot North High School. It was a good example of they are providing training for persons who are looking to work in the childcare industry, primarily high schoolers, and eventually growing beyond just Minot High, but also other regional high schools. If you haven't had a chance to go up there, I highly recommend it. It's a great use of economic development dollars to train our workforce, which is the biggest barrier we face in economic development right now. And I think there's a lot of potential for that building moving forward. So appreciated that. Now we're looking forward to beginning to make a recommendation to this body on what can be done with childcare here in the next, not quite by December, but in the next month or two. So that's where we're at.
Thank you, Scott. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also was involved in the MPO meeting that Lisa talked about, along with Harold and some other staff. And there is a lot getting done in that group. And I'm also part of the City County Park School District Liaison Group. And in addition to the enclave issue, we also talked about the upcoming election planning for 24, and as well as kind of what is the path for some of the opioid lawsuit settlement funds that the county and the city are receiving. And it turns out that there's a couple of different avenues from those. County, I believe, goes through their national association or that direction, and the city's funds, I think, are funneled through the state. So it's two kind of separate funds. They ultimately, though, really, First District Health Unit is likely the recipient of those funds to further the promotion of health in the community with that. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Paul?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Visit Minot board meeting, I was unable to attend due to a conflict last week. Our last Renaissance Zone board meeting was canceled, and the Magic Fund guideline rewrite presentation Harold stole from me, so I guess we'll go with that.
All right, thank you. Before we move on, as we approach Thanksgiving, I just want to take a couple minutes to reflect on being thankful for our staff, the management team, the entire staff of the city of Minot. For those of you who get to spend it with your family, I hope it's filled with family and fun and gratitude. For those who have to work, I really wish and hope for a safe and quiet holiday. I'm also thankful for the members of the council, for your vision, your commitment, the time you put in, and your passion for serving the city of Minot. So just know that I'm grateful and I'm thankful for your service. So with that, we will move on to adjournment. Is there a motion?
So moved.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are, happy Thanksgiving.